Okay, that's us, guys. So I'm just going to disappear now, and I'll let you go on with the session. I'll obviously deal with any admin in the background, and you can just give me a shout if you need any help with anything.
Perfect. Thank you, Stuart. And welcome everybody to our first Books That Help webinar, hopefully the first of many. We are both delighted to see so many people here, and I know lots of you are going to be watching this back as a recording. In fact, don't want to scare you, Ellie, but we had in total 218 people register their interest, which is fantastic. And yeah, we're really grateful for everyone's support. And I think it's reassuring from my point of view that there is a need and a desire for these kinds of events. So yeah, thank you to everybody who supported us. So what we're here this evening to do is in part to talk about the Books That Help mentorship, which applications open for today. But in case you're not going to apply or you're not eligible, we're also going to be talking about books with social messages more generally. When I say we, I mean me, Clare, Helen, Welsh. I'm a children's writer, and the lovely Ellie Farmer, who is on my right. Ellie is editorial director of Little Tiger Press, who has very generously agreed to help me this evening run a webinar for you. So the evening is going to look a bit like this. We're going to talk a bit about books that help, books with messages, some tips, what to avoid, some techniques, some themes that might be relevant, and some really good examples that we think are fantastic books that help. And then there will also be a chance to ask Ellie and I any questions about social message books, about the mentorship, about anything else. But I thought I'd just start off very briefly with a little run through of how we came to be here this evening. So I had this idea to start a review site, I suppose, initially for shining a light on books that have social messages at their heart, that are doing really important things for families. I think that probably comes from, well, obviously, my passion / obsession for picture books, but also I'm particularly drawn to books that help people. And maybe that's because I was a primary school teacher for 14 years. Maybe it's because I guess I'm a generally kind of caring person, but I'm just drawn to books that make a difference. And I want to make a difference. It's my why. It's why I want to be part of the book community. So on the Books That Help site, you'll find categories such as moving house, starting school, neurodiversity, bereavement, with some recommended books and reviews on there. And I've tried to kind of put ideas for how you might use these stories therapeutically. So hopefully that's a good place to start. But I wanted to do more. I also wanted to be able to help other writers who have a passion like me for writing books that make a difference, which is where the mentorship was born. Somewhere along the line, Ellie said to me, if we can help at all, Little Tiger, do let me know. And then I kind of roped Ellie in, hopefully quite willingly. So the mentorship started from there. What we're offering really is a chance for you and I to work together. So we're looking for a writer with a story they're really passionate about. Over a series of virtual sessions, we'll be working together to make the story the best it can be with the help of Little Tiger. So Perry, who is a senior editor at Little Tiger Press, is going to help shortlist the applications and provide some feedback. Once the story is ready, we'll be able to submit to Little Tiger for a first look. But we thought this webinar would be a great opportunity for everybody to learn a bit more about these particular kinds of books. So whether you're applying for the webinar or not, or the mentorship or not, you'll be able to hopefully apply these things to your writing and just learn a bit more about these special kind of picture books that are a joy to write. So just one more thing about the mentorship. I guess I'll just do the rules whilst we're talking about it. The application's open this evening. The applications are open for 1 month, so they'll close at midnight on the 19th of November. We're asking people just to submit one story per person, so think very carefully about which book it is that you're particularly feel needs to be out into the world. And it's open to unagented, traditionally unpublished writers. So Ellie, I've done my little bit of spiel there. Ellie and I have worked together for a few years now. I don't exactly know how many, but Ellie has been my editor for several books that help. So I was absolutely delighted that she has agreed to chat with us about books with social messages and to help people along the way, mentorship and otherwise. So Ellie, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Thank you, Claire, I will. So hi, I'm Ellie Farmer. I am the editorial director at Little Tiger Press. Little Tiger Press, who are obviously very proud to publish. I should do a small snippet of promo for you, Claire. First of all, The Tide. Then we published The Perfect Shelter. We have Everything Changes on the list for this year. And Claire's fourth book with us, Sunny Side Up, will be coming to bookshops near you next year. All of which I think for me have a really strong message at their core. They're all very different, but I think, Claire, you really managed to tap into and target some of those challenging themes, emotional themes, but things that are universal to so many children, families out there. And I think you managed to do it with an awful lot of heart. And I think that's why those books and your writing is so incredibly successful. So I think that this feels like a really natural next step for you, and like what a great idea to help other writers who also feel like they've got something important that they want to share, a message that they want to share with other people.
Oh, thank you, Ellie. Well, you know how important the team is. You know, it's never just one person. It's a fantastic team behind those books, but I'm very proud of them all.
Me too. Proud to publish them on the list. It's very exciting.
Wow, thank you. Okay, so if it's okay, then we're going to pick your brain about books that help from your side of the desk, from your point of view, how we can write them, what to avoid, themes, I suppose. So I've got a few questions to ask you, and if you have any questions in the audience towards the end of the webinar, I'll ask you to put them into the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can. So save them up. So first of all, I think I know what a book that helps is in my head, but what would your definition be of a book that helps?
Okay, so just as a quick thing to everybody in the room, I just wanted to let you know, if it looks like I'm sort of diverting my eyes around the room, it's because I've got notes written down, some notes on my screen, and then some show and tell books next to me. So bear with me. I am paying attention. I promise. I think books that help for me are picture books which are more than just a great story. I think they are always a great story, but at their heart, they contain a topic or a message or a theme which I think that probably the author is intending to act as a springboard for discussion, so to be shared with that can be shared with a child in a reading situation where you can just enjoy the story, but actually if you look just a little bit deeper, there's something there at its heart which can promote further discussion about something which is either specific to something that the child might be going through, might be specific to an emotion, maybe that the child is feeling, potentially like anger, maybe jealousy. Sometimes it might be something like grief or bereavement, and opening up the discussion about death. What happens when we die, and what are the associated feelings and processes that accompany something like that. Serious illness, which Claire has tackled obviously in The Perfect Shelter, and also dementia in The Tide. I think kind of also topics that provoke thought and emotional growth and stimulation and thought and discussion would also be things like I think a really hot topic at the moment is resilience in kids, and grit and determination, and the concept that it's okay that failure happens, and actually what you choose to do with failure, because it's not necessarily a negative, because out of failure can come growth and development. So something that tackles grit, I think, and the ability to accept failure and move forward through it would be a book for me that helps, because accepting change, I think, again, I mean, I keep referring back to Clare's books because I think that they do them so beautifully, but Everything Changes again tackles that idea that change happens, that it can be scary. And I think it's about books that help, for me, acknowledge that these things that are being talked about inside the story are hard, can be hard, and it's okay to accept that they are hard, a bit gnarly, and can be difficult, but that out of opening up the discussion comes acceptance, comes forward progression, comes tolerance, for example. So I suppose that's a slightly sprawling answer to you there, but I think hopefully it's touched on some of the topics that I think might fall within that category of books that help. I mean, for you, Clare, have I missed anything out there that you think you might want to sort of add that I've kind of not covered?
I think you answered that question beautifully. You know, you're talking about stories that are, you know, enjoyable in the first and foremost, but that also have another layer that is more meaningful. And I love the way you describe books as promoting discussion, because that is it. That's it for me. It's a, you know, it could just be a story. The child just might want just to listen to a story time, which is absolutely great. But there's the opportunity to, there's room there for an honest space that can open out some of the really challenging things. And I think stories are a really nice, safe place to unpick these horrible things that happen sometimes in life. But I think in terms of themes, I think it's interesting for me and great for probably everybody here to know that there are kind of topics like, you know, the more serious end of things, illness, grief, but we're also talking about everyday type of themes, you know, anything that helps a child through, you know, the ups and downs of their life as it is at the moment in today's world. So resilience, I think, is probably very well picked. Yeah, so it's interesting to think about what children are going through, I suppose, in today's world, and what they might need in a story to help them. Yeah, so that's interesting for me, I suppose, to think about the wider span of different topics. Presumably, it covers things like sharing, self-confidence, you know, all those little sort of personal, social issues as well that young children, I guess, the perennial topics that all children are going to face.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I mean, forgive me if I kind of hold stuff up throughout, and do forgive me, because quite a lot of the books that I have here are Little Tiger books, so I do have some others that are not. So it's I'm promise I'm using them more as a demonstration tool rather than a promotion. Though I appreciate that might well be how it appears. I promise I'm genuinely doing it as a sort of a guide. I think there are so many things that I suppose it's about encouraging empathy and encouraging the child that you're reading it with, if they're not going through the thing that they're particularly talking about, but encouraging to think, you know, what might somebody they know be feeling or thinking about if they are going through something like that. And also just acceptance and kind of depicting different sorts of personality types as well, and different kind of motivation. Because I think one thing that for me I've noticed coming through in sorts of themes that in picture books and also in kind of wider discussions of things like kind of concepts about introversion, what makes us an introvert and what makes us an extrovert. Because I think talking to a lot of my friends who have kids, I think introversion is a really important topic to explore, because I think historically a lot of kids who might be more introverted are kind of perceived as being shy, but actually that's a really sort of two-dimensional way of viewing it. I suppose introversion can be so many things. You know, you can manage to cope in like a big situation, but actually it's about knowing that you just need that quiet time to recharge your batteries. And for example, like, you know, Mole's Quiet Place, which is by Jane Chapman, is a really neat book that I think handles that topic or touches on that topic really gently and in a way that sort of normalizes feelings of not wanting to be in or not feeling comfortable in really big crowds, and why that is. It's not about being shy per se, it's just about needing that time away from that and that precious time of being alone to kind of recharge your batteries. So that for me would fall in under another topic of kind of books that help, like greater understanding.
Yeah, great. And you said something about how that story gently introduces that topic. So if we go on to think about how a writer might approach a theme like this, I mean, what would your sort of top tips be, and what should we avoid doing in terms of an approach to a book that helps?
Yeah, so I thought quite hard about this, and I suppose that I think you can often tell, I can often tell when a text lands on my desk, which kind of at its heart deals with a message that might be considered a little more difficult or challenging or tough to talk about. I think you can often tell when that text has been written by somebody from a place of experience. It's funny because I think you can really feel the heart and the experience of the author being channeled into the story that's coming out. And I think that, and this is something I'd like, maybe to put to you as well, Claire, because I think that what makes that text resonate for me as a reader coming to it fresh is the fact that the characters are very fully formed in the story, that the voice feels really authentic, and that the way that the emotion is conveyed, or the way that the message is conveyed, is done with such a truth, and it's that I think then will make it resonate to the wider audience, to many readers, because everything feels very resolved inside that picture book story. So I suppose for me, a starting point is when it's something that is personal to you and that you've experienced, that maybe that opens a gate to like the creative writing process. I mean, is that how you find you write? Have you managed to write those particular stories?
Yeah, I can't quite translate what it is that comes across, so maybe you've picked up on some of those things, but sometimes they just, I guess, there's a need to want to write. To be honest, the books that I've written with you, they've almost been for myself first. So, with The Perfect Shelter, is a diagnosis of cancer and dementia, which, in the tide, they kind of were born from real life situations that we were going through. I guess in a way I was kind of processing them myself. And that's maybe where the heart and truth comes in. But I do think there's two things. There's a really important link between intimacy and creativity. I think those two things are very closely linked, especially if you're writing these kinds of books where you're going to be very honest and bare your soul in a way. But also it's actually helpful to write. These books are actually helping the writers who are writing the books that help. So I mean, it's great to hear that comes across, and that's useful probably for everybody here, to channel their truths, channel their personal experience, and it's reassuring to know those things come across in writing, in authentic characters, in the heart and the emotions. So that's really helpful advice, I think. And yeah, I find that if I'm trying to write about something I don't care about, it probably does show. There's probably something missing. Yeah, you can't really shoehorn these things in, can you, if you're writing this kind of picture book?
No, definitely not. And obviously, I mean, that's just one way in for an author. And if you've had that personal experience, or you found, that's, you're writing from a place that you've been through as a process to kind of processing your own emotions on a particular subject, I think that's one way. But I don't think it precludes you, if you haven't lived that experience, from being able to write, because I mean, it's fiction. It's this is what authors do, create worlds that maybe not necessarily are kind of directly impacting on them. And so I think that's it, just because it's not true to you, it doesn't mean that you're unable to tackle things, that some of the topics that we've talked about just now. So I think if you haven't, that's absolutely fine. But then if you haven't, then it's about thinking about, okay, so how do I make sure that the characters that I'm creating, the characters I'm writing, as all authors do in all works of fiction that they write, how do I ensure that this character feels fully realized, that their voice feels really kind of true and authentic, and I think it's also, and then how do my key characters interact with one another to ensure that I'm making clear that the emotional connection is there between my characters inside my story, and how do I make sure that my story feels relevant to the characters that I've created. So it's kind of all about those building blocks of writing a narrative. And I think the other thing I have found is that when books that help, that maybe have a more weighty topic at their heart, are combined with a narrative, it's also then very important, I think, to ensure that the narrative doesn't become too overly complicated, because then what you're trying to do is it's about working out what the priority needs to be in terms of your story. Is it the narrative arc? Is it the hook and the message? Is it my character's emotional progression from start to finish? And so sometimes you need to kind of prioritize the character's emotional journey if it's something that is kind of quite an emotionally charged text, and avoid kind of working in too much kind of complicated narrative or storyline or plotting that's maybe going to kind of conflict in 12 story spreads, which is a really very sort of small contained space, which is why I think anyone who can manage to do that, convey story, character, plot, emotional journey inside 12 spreads, it's such an incredible art. I have to take my hat off to authors who can manage it. It's just it's not easy. It's a very difficult art form to crack.
You've given some great advice there, though, Ellie, because basically what we're saying is that even if it's short-lived experience, empathy is key. So you have to really be able to get behind your characters and imagine, I guess, like you say, like writers do, imagine how it would feel, an authentic storyline. And it sounds also like, in terms of driving the story, that perhaps in these books the emotional journey drives the action rather than the other way around. And I think it's a lot of the time I'm trying to write books that don't feel too slight in terms of action, but in these kinds of books, because the emotions are the forefront of what we're trying to take away, and leave the reader with, that interesting to think of them as driving the story rather than the other way around. So I think that's helpful. I'm writing notes. I don't often know how I do these things, because they come sort of organically. It's quite interesting to actually sit and unpick how they are developed and why they work. So this is really interesting.
And I mean because I'm talking to you, and because what your books are do this very successfully. I think, for example, if we take The Tide, in terms of the hierarchy of what happens in that story, it's effectively just one day at the beach. And in terms of the narrative arc, very little happens. So there is no complex plot line in that. But what does happen is you take your main protagonist on a really large, on a really kind of quite deep emotional journey from start to finish, and a process of understanding, and actually you marry that to the allegory with the tide, of seeing the tide like memory, which is sometimes far away or sometimes close and near. So it's very, very simple, but actually what's topmost in the hierarchy there is that emotional arc, that process of understanding that you take your character on, and everything else is kind of sort of quite pared back to give space to that emotion, that big emotional journey. But that's not to say that I'm just looking at my examples that I also have along here. And I'm just trying to think. My Big Shouting Day, for example, is a book that actually, is a modern classic in my opinion. So My Big Shouting Day, if nobody's familiar with it, written by Rebecca Patterson, essentially follows our main protagonist Bella on quite a complex day of a toddler from start to finish, and it's just a very, very angry day that she is having, and she is really feeling all of the anger, and it's very funny. It's very I defy anybody of any age not to identify with the protagonist in this book. And it follows a very regular plot, but there's still quite a lot that happens within her day, but the emotion is so strong. And I think it's great to name it, and actually okay to lean into showing that it's all right to kind of demonstrate kind of quite I suppose what you would term to be like a negative anger, it's okay to show that because it's real, it's reality, it's life.
And thinking about the stories that maybe don't have such a profound kind of plot, presumably escalation is still important. So, you know, they're not talking about, even though there might be so much narrative, there still has to be, you know, escalation and story arc, and, you know, and otherwise I guess it'd be too linear, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're spot on, Claire. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, escalation of some kind to build you to that, whether it's kind of like an intense emotional sort of escalation of anger, escalation of drama, escalation of feeling of something, or interaction between two characters. Maybe if it's about jealousy, a book about jealousy, for example, how is that going to play off? It's about the dramatic tension building. Yeah.
So it's okay to be cruel to the characters.
Yeah, sometimes I think it, yeah.
Sometimes. And interestingly, because you chose My Big Shouting Day, the ones we've done together have been more lyrical up until now. But presumably there are lots of different ways that the writers can come at these themes. They don't just have to be poetic, lyrical stories. They can be funny, you know, funny ways of approaching books that help as well.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. Definitely, I agree. I think that for me, two books that I think do so with humour are Can I Join Your Club by John Kelly and illustrated by Steph Lebaris, which is essentially about acceptance and being inclusive. It has a very simple narrative arc, but actually says an awful lot in very few words, but does do with a lot of kind of very quite ironic humour in there, and actually makes you really kind of engage with your lead character, and you really feel for Duck as he's trying to find someone to be in to join he desperately wants to join everybody's club, and when nobody accepts him, he decides to set up his own club. And the only remit of being able to join is if you want to be in a club with him. So he welcomes everybody into his, and it's a really very, very satisfying and funny ending, but actually it says a lot. So yes, I think you can absolutely do it with humour. And sometimes that helps.
Yeah. Yeah, but it can be nice to, you know, I guess children relate to humour, don't they? Everyone relates to humour. And yeah, and it feels good to laugh. So I guess it helps on several levels, as well as with the message. It actually feels good to have a giggle. Did you bring some books? Sorry, I interrupted you then.
I did bring some books. I think another one that I think I would flag would be like, The Only Way is Badger. So again, it's about acceptance, but also about challenging when somebody is wrong and calling it out, and actually identifying the subtle ways in which people can try and manipulate language to try and exclude people. Again, done with a gentle kind of humour to try and identify the fact that when bad behaviour is bad behaviour, and how do you tackle that, and does so with in a really sort of gently humorous way. And I do think sometimes it does help with humor, because it kind of comes back to a pitfall, an occasional pitfall that I find with kind of texts that tend to deal with a more challenging topic, is that sometimes the overall tone of the story can sometimes feel quite negative.
That's interesting. So too much focus on the message.
No, I think actually, if you don't mind, if we use another one of your books as an example, let's say, but For Everything Changes, do you remember when you were in the kind of the development process, we were thinking that, you know, it deals with divorce, which is very sad, but how can we kind of work in a way of showing moments of kind of happiness, and you know, that spring has arrived, or that the seasons change, that there is sunshine and light in all of this, but also the darkness, so that you can temper the way that the overall tone of the the emotion that's being channeled into the book, how it feels. Because I guess you have to remember, the thing I always think about is that you want to have this reading experience with a child with you. And so what is the overall feeling that you want to have in that moment when you're sharing that book with them? And as you did in The Tide as well, I think focusing on those moments when there is joy and happiness between between grandpa and his granddaughter, I think it gives you that light and dark, and avoids the moments of it, or avoids it all focusing on the drawbacks of living with somebody who is living with dementia.
So making sure there's hope in there. I guess maybe thinking about why would a parent be buying your book? What would they want to gain from sharing this book with a child? It has to be, I guess, an uplifting ultimate message. And yeah, interesting story with that Everything Changes, which some people I think probably know, but it was all set in winter, which I guess overall was a bit more bleak. And then it was your idea, Ellie, to say, perhaps this could go across seasons rather than just being winter. And that did automatically lift the story. And certainly the balance across the spreads was a lot more hopeful.
Oh, definitely, it definitely is, and I because I think it's about marrying the two. It's not trying to exclude the darker, sadder emotions. It's saying these darker, sadder emotions exist, but how can I balance that with showing moments where, despite the darkness and the sadness, we actually find light, because because that is true to life anyway, but also because the genre and the format is kind of targeted at kids, you want to ensure that actually you do give some hope and some uplift.
Even well, I guess isn't there a saying from Dumbledore, even in the darkest times there still always some hope and some light, isn't there? It's about finding it and sharing it with the reader.
Yeah, definitely. Great quote.
Paraphrased it slightly there. Were there any other things, any other pitfalls or techniques or tips that you think would be good to share with everybody? Or we covered those?
No, the only last thing I would say is an example I have here is from Goodbye Bear, by Jane Chapman again. It's okay, I think, to name. I think it's important, actually, if you're talking about grief and death and loss, I think it's really important that we name it, that we name death, that we don't try and circumnavigate it or just avoid it. So the opening lines that Jane's written in this is that Bear died on a Friday, while sunlight speckled the grass and caterpillars nibbled the leaves in the forest. And I just think she manages that, she delivers that so perfectly balanced. And actually it does back to what I was trying to say about, you can have this very dark Bear died on a Friday, quite stark, but it is normalizing it in a way, because death is normal and everyday, unfortunately, but it's it can happen. The darkest time, the darkest, most upsetting thing can happen while sunlight speckles the grass and caterpillars leave it and life goes on. So it's just that very subtle, gentle kind of marrying of two very opposing things, and you don't need to be worried about naming something. I think it's important that you probably do.
So balance is key. Don't shy away from the difficult things, but make sure there's hope as well to balance out. Nice.
Yeah, I mean, how do you
feel?
What do you think?
I think that makes perfect sense. And actually, I'd forgotten about Everything Changes being quite so bleak, but you're right. It possibly it's I guess it's important to, if you're like me, writing from a place that you've also got to remember that this is a book for gatekeepers, for young children, and what do you want them to take away from it? So balancing out the raw emotions that you feel with a hopeful, uplifting story, and merging those two things together, I suppose, in a narrative. Easy.
I mean, is it easy? Do you find it is easy to write kind of to when you were writing those?
The Perfect Shelter, I think, was possibly the quickest story I've ever written. But I was literally thinking about how am I going to tell my children that our uncle had a brain tumor. And I woke up one night and pretty much wrote the first draft on my phone. So that one did come out quite easily. But if I take, for example, Everything Changes, that one has many, many, many drafts, and was more tricky to write. And I think I had a conversation with you the other day, but although my parents did divorce, it wasn't a tricky divorce, and so I didn't necessarily have the lived experience that I needed to write it. And so it took me a long time to really find that core emotional message that I wanted to share, because there were so many things going on, blame, guilt, shame, change, and it was quite difficult to stream that down into one thing. So maybe that would be one piece of advice that I would give to writers coming at this, is to be specific, because I guess even bereavement and grief, there are so many different tiny little threads in terms of messages you can give to children in terms of grief. The loved ones live on with us, that we can remember them in our memories. That there was just so many slightly different things come full circle, slightly different things you can say, and I think maybe this can easily be muddled if you haven't got a clear idea of one thing that you want to pass on to children that you think they should know. And I think that's what was happening for me in Everything Changes initially. There was a lot of emotions going on, and it was difficult for me to work out what one thing I really wanted children to take away. Eventually, over many drafts, it kind of came out as this idea that change is difficult, but it can bring good things. It took me a while, and I certainly had different versions on the boil. So that one wasn't easy. No, that one was trickier. And I think that's because it wasn't clear enough in my mind, I think, what it is I wanted to say to children and what I wanted to pass on. So that may be something to consider, people writing these types of books, is just to be really, really clear as you can be about one thing that you want your book to do.
I think, yes, I think you've absolutely nailed it on the head, Claire, because I think that there is that one line in Everything Changes, and I'm going to do a terrible job of paraphrasing it now, and that's the one blab that I didn't have with me. Hang on a minute, do I in my bag of tricks? But you'll know better than me. I'll be putting those into your mouth. But when you know everything, oh, Claire, you say it. Oh gosh, I
don't know. How bad is it?
No, I'm putting you on the spot here.
You're talking about the last line, aren't you? And
wait. I'm so embarrassed. I'm so sorry.
I do know it, but it's a bit before I'm forgetting.
Oh, you have it there. Okay. I've built you up now. Sorry, everybody.
Just like the seasons, change can bring good things. And when you know that, everything changes.
That's it. That was it. That was the clincher. I mean, when I feel like when I read that, I was like, this is it. This is what I know that this is what this book is about. This is perfect. And then everything kind of falls around that. So would you say that once you'd kind of found that hook, that kind of zinger, that that thing, that line that encapsulates everything, I mean, the hook, did it kind of provide a really kind of great driving force that you could hang everything else off then?
Focus, I think, was focus. Once I knew that was the message I wanted readers to take away, I always had to go back and make sure that was actually what everything was saying all the way along. So I guess if it's about change, bringing good things, then initially, working backwards, you had to start off with a child who was really worried about change and all the big changes that occur when their families, when their parents are going to break up. And that kind of gave me an arc, I suppose. But until I really knew what it was I wanted to take away, it's quite difficult to work backwards. And maybe that's what I was sort of trying to tell myself the story, to work out what it was I needed to say. Yeah, I got there eventually. Whereas, and I guess it just depends on the story, but sometimes that comes to me more easily than others. But yes, when you get it, then you're like, yes, this is what I wanted to say. And you can trace back. Okay, so whilst we're chatting, Ellie, I'm going to ask anybody who has a question to pop it into the chat box, because then I can ask Ellie if it's for her, and read them out. But I think we've gone into quite a lot of detail, haven't we? Which is great. Lots of sort of nitty-picky things about writing books that help, and it's not just superficial. Have a theme and do this. Actually, quite a lot of in-depth ideas about hopefully helpful things. You're building the suspense. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Hopefully people have things that they'd like answers to. If not, maybe we did a brilliant job of anticipating questions. Tara has a question, Ellie. Are there any themes that you've seen too much of? That's a good question.
So, are there themes that I've seen too or too little of? Oh, well, that's actually quite a tricky question to answer, Tara. So books that kind of tackle things like grief, dementia, serious illness, divorce, are kind of the very darker and more challenging, trickier topics. And I think that usually a publishing house, if they have one on their list, that is the book that that deals with that, and that is what they would like to have on their list. So it is a trickier thing to pitch to a house if they already have something like that deals with that on their books. That said, that's not to stop anybody from writing it, because there are plenty of channels in which you can share and in which you can publish. So I don't think there's anything that I've seen too much of. That said, I would not, now that I have the Tide on my list and now that I have Goodbye Bear, I wouldn't be actively looking for something that deals with death or deals with dementia. But there are a lot of other publishing houses out there, so it is not kind of an exclusion on doing that. If there is anything that I've seen too little of, I think things that I think, topics and themes that I think might be starting to come out, I'd be interested to see more books that kind of, if there's any way of kind of coming up with a book that maybe tackles war, conflict, and does so with sensitivity, but that acts as a springboard to discussion. Because I think a great one that does do that sparks thought about conflict and about war is The Conquerors by Dave McKean, which is an absolute classic, or The Spots and the Dots. And forgive me, I've forgotten the author off the top of my head and I didn't have the book with me. But again, I think that is something I'm very interested in seeing more of. And again, things that talk about more overlooked sort of personality types, like introversion, let's say, which have maybe been a bit overlooked and maybe just kind of pigeonholed as a child being shy. I think this is the point in time where I think we should like kind of explore and talk about that and represent children like that in a little bit more of a positive light or a different way.
A question says, and we were talking about naming things head on and not shying away from naming death and dying. What about racism from a child's perspective? Is it okay to name racism head on?
Oh, again, Christ, that's a very difficult topic, isn't it? And I think you have to, and I feel like I would be without the vocabulary to be able to do that or to explain or understand how you would do that. And having been a child that has suffered from racism, I think it is important, because I think if I think back, that's exactly what my mum explained to me. She named the word, she used the word, and I think it's important because I think that gives you the vocabulary then to understand and to have a discussion around what it is and why people are aiming negative words at you. So yes, I think the answer is yes. I think you should.
Thank you, Ellie. And Alex says, is there information at the back of the book, so back matter that they'd like to submit? Would they include this when you submit to a publisher, or just send the story?
Oh, when you say back matter, Do you mean sort of like teaching notes, or an explanation behind why you wrote the story? I don't know. Sorry,
Maybe
I'm
Alex
asking a
can.
question to your question.
What would it be if it was teaching notes? Would you like to see those as part of the submission?
Again, let me think.
I guess you wouldn't have to necessarily move forward with them, but would it be useful to see where the writer was coming from?
I think it's interesting to know where the writer was coming from. But I always feel like if you feel like you have to supply the back matter to convey the story behind the story, is the story in itself working hard enough to convey the message that you wanted it to do in the first place? So I'm not going to say no to you, but I feel like if you feel like you have to submit the backstory that goes alongside the story you're trying to say, then is the story you've written actually going far enough in conveying the message that you want to kind of share? I hope that answers your question.
I think so. What about rhyme? Is it okay to receive stories in rhyme?
Well, at Little Tiger, yes, it is fine for rhyme. We publish in rhyme as long as there is quite a strong narrative arc in there, because for us, co-edition and being able to publish widely and in translation is really important to us as a publisher. And as long as there's a strong enough story arc, then yes, rhyme works for us.
Okay. Kirsty says, in terms of applying for the mentorship, do we include an author's note if we have one, or just as text? So when you go to apply, Kirsty, there is some information about what to include, and essentially it's the story and then up to 500 words of who you are and why you think this is a really important book to share with the world. So you can add that all in one document, but that little part at the top, which might put your story into context for us. So yes, you can include a brief note at the top. Can you submit illustrations too? Yes. So we said author or author illustrator. So if you have some illustrations alongside, then you can definitely send those. Also, would you ideally want notes on illustrations? So I think again when you go to apply, it says you can add illustration notes, but please put them in different colour and in brackets, and just only include them if they're super essential. Is that what you'd say, Ellie, if they're essential to the plot?
Yeah.
And
again, with illustration notes, my caveat on that is always, yes, include them if you feel it's necessary, but if you find yourself writing too much in the illustration note, then you have to wonder then you have to kind of go back and reanalyze your story, and is your story doing enough to convey the story, to convey the plot? Because again, so many picture books are shared in front of a class, and if the child at the back of your class can't understand what's happening in the picture because they're too far away, then they're actually going to be missing quite an awful lot of the narrative inside. So it's kind of being mindful of including a lot of narrative inside your illustration notes and not in the text itself.
Just going down to questions that we haven't answered yet. Sue has a question. What would you say is the most important part of a book that helps? Is it a great setup, a perfect ending, everything in the middle? Obviously they're all important, but is there one thing that you say is more important?
Oh, no. And I feel like this is not going to be a helpful answer to your question, but I think it is very specific. I think it's very specific to the story and the message that you're trying to share and how you're trying to convey it. Because I think there's such a huge spectrum. I appreciate that's not a very conclusive answer for you. Sorry.
All three. Yeah. And Kirsty says, what about the perfect word count?
Between 300 and 600 words.
Fantastic. So I was just reading Sarah's comment. So Sarah says, would a book like this be too specific? For example, tackling an issue that not many kids come across. Would that be less appealing to a publisher? Does it need to be a theme that lots of people can relate to?
That's tricky. I suppose it's about without knowing what the specific topic is. It comes back to this kind of idea of layering. I think that often the most successful picture book books tend to be able to marry together several things. So I'm going to use the example of the tide again, because I think it does that very well. It's got the hook and the message. It's got the allegory, which is the tide is like memory, and then it's got this core relationship between the grandfather and the grandchild. So I think if you're talking about a specific theme or something that is quite kind of very specific and not kind of particularly universal, I suppose it's okay to include that. And talking generally, because I'm not sure what the specific theme is, but then it's about thinking, well, okay, so if this is the theme, what's my story that I'm wrapping around it? And is the story that I'm wrapping around it actually got enough inside it that's going to be appealing as a story in itself? Or is it that it's handled with humor and that there's enough kind of comedy and humor in the way that I'm delivering this in terms of the personality, and actually that is the thing that is going to make it, give it the ability to be shared with a lot of children. And then actually if you had somebody in your life that had this specific problem that was quite niche, then and they saw that and felt represented, would that be okay? But is there enough wrapped around it that makes it a kind of a universal, gives it a universal appeal that is going to mean that it will be able to be widely shared?
That makes sense, doesn't it? Because I guess, it could be read in different layers, different levels. Somebody might be reading it, stories about a grandparent day at the beach, and somebody with dementia in their lives may be able to unpick it at another level again.
Yeah.
What about bullying a child based on their appearance or identity? Would that be too limiting?
I find bullying really, it's a very, very difficult topic to write about, because I think it's particularly challenging because what you don't want to encourage and what you don't want to display and what you don't want to kind of give examples of are, you don't want to give examples of name calling. You don't want to give, because what you don't want is you would hate for one child to read a name that has been used in a book that is about a book about bullying, and then use that phrase to bully and target a child because they've read it inside a book. So it's about thinking about how you depict a bully, but without promoting or encouraging bullying behavior. And I think that is very, very difficult to achieve. I suppose, as an example, the only way of Badger is a bit of a bully in this, but the way that the story is structured is he's an animal, for starters. It's a grown-up, for starters. It's very, very tied into the wordplay that he uses about, and it's not targeting anybody's physical appearance, because otherwise I think that you're sort of highlighting that it's, or depicting that it's okay, or representing that it's okay, or not that you're not saying that it's okay, but you're showing that I do apologize, because now I feel like I've completely lost all of my words and I've become incredibly inarticulate.
That makes sense what you're saying, I think.
I'm so sorry, because I feel like it's quite a difficult question and I'm not answering it in particularly adept way. But I think it's because it's very, very difficult to do without inadvertently promoting that and displaying and showing that bullying behavior, and doing it in a way where it is kind of unacceptable from the off, without then the overall tone of your book being very negative. So it's very, very challenging to do well. I'm not saying don't attempt it. I'm just saying that I feel like it would have been wrought with possible pitfalls.
Yeah. No, it's extremely helpful to have your honest opinion on these things. I'm just looking at questions that we haven't answered yet, because I'm wary of the time. Self-published books was fine, yes. Concept books, I think we're looking for picture books as opposed to sort of a younger book for toddlers and babies. We've talked about themes in the background. Do stories like this always need to be about contemporary real life and children, or could we address these same emotional themes with animal or fantasy characters or children from different historical periods?
Okay, I'll try and be quick and articulate this time. Real life children, I think in certain circumstances with certain themes, yes, it helps. I think that probably when we come to stories about racism, I think that it's probably better to be frank and use human characters and name it, though I can also see the benefits of being able to explore sort of wider topics of inclusivity when it's an animal cast. So both. Emotional themes with animal fantasy, yes. Little Tiger, I mean, lots of publishers use animals as characters as a vehicle to kind of be able to springboard onto quite challenging topics, because it kind of gives you that one remove when it isn't humans. But children from a different historical period, trickier, because when we're talking about picture books, essentially it's really important for picture books to be able to be translatable into a lot of languages, and when you kind of focus on historical periods, it's very hard to make them historical periods which are universal. So for example, you know, Victorian England is very specifically Victorian England. It's kind of feels very uniquely different to France at that same time, or Germany at that time, or America, for example, or Africa, or China, or, you know, India. It's much more restrictive, and therefore it can be less universal.
Okay, so 2 more questions, Ellie, if we can squeeze them in. Deirdre is asking about, so she said, Little Tiger seems to have character-driven stories with human and animal protagonists. Do you think there's an interesting concept books that have SEL theme? Quite sure what SEL means, but like the perfect fit or circle. What is Little Tiger's preference? So I think maybe inanimate objects, then not. Like, is it okay to have a book that helps with a character that's not human or animal? I think that's where that question's coming from. Apologies, Deirdre, if I got that wrong.
Oh no, I think I understand. I think I totally understand. Yes, I mean, the perfect fit. I love that book. I would have loved to acquire it. And also the spots and the dots, I think that's great, and also deals with shapes. Also have 2 Layers Press here, which is not a book that helps, but I mean, again, it features shapes, not animal or human characters.
Super. Do you think a book that helps works better written in first person, third person? Does it make any difference?
I don't think it makes a difference. I think it's very story specific.
Super. Okay, and maybe just last one squeezed in there that I've just seen, which is, are you interested in stories about neurodiversity or invisible disabilities?
Yes.
Great. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I'm sure we could go on for a lot longer otherwise. But Ellie, thank you so much for giving up your time this evening to talk to us about books that help. I think it will be super helpful for everybody who's hopefully going to apply for the mentorship, and we're looking forward to reading those stories, but also just people writing about these books with a truth that they think, you know, need to be out into the world. Hopefully it's relative to everybody, you know, they apply to their writing, irrespective of whether or not they're going to apply for the mentorship. So, you know, you've given really in-depth and honest, thorough answers, and I'm very grateful, and I'm sure everybody else is too. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for all your very lovely comments to everybody that are pinging up here. So thanks.
I also want to thank you to Stuart, because Stuart has been helping me with the tech stuff involved in webinars and applications and Google Forms, of which I have no knowledge. So yeah, we're really grateful for Right Mentor for helping support our mentorship and our Books That Help campaign. So thank you. And thanks to everybody who came. So the mentorship opens this evening, open for a month, and we're looking forward to seeing what stories you